Hello and welcome back to the history of Bangalore. You're with me, Ramjee Chandran, and this is episode 96 of season 2. It's part 3 of my mini-series on the rise of the British in India and their inevitable collision with Mysore. In the last 2 episodes, we watched the British presence in India transform from a group of London merchants into a territorial sovereign, armed, legally sanctioned, and in possession of all of Bengal's revenues. Today we bring those stories together. The question is not whether these two powers were going to collide, they were. The question is how it happened. Through what sequence of decisions and miscalculations the space between them closed. But before I jump into all that, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. To get a bird's eye view of everything that I'm going to say in this episode, we will follow the sequence of events from the conquest of Bidanur in 1763 to the Treaty of Hyderabad in 1766. It was that Treaty of Hyderabad that actually provided the trigger that could bring British forces to Bengaluru. It was no longer a possibility, it became a formal, legal obligation. By 1761, Hyder Ali was the de facto ruler of Mysore and the Wadiyar rulers were only kings in name. Hyder Ali allowed them to be on the throne. He didn't call himself Sultan or coronate himself, and he held every instrument of actual power. But ruling a state is not the same as building one, and Hyder had inherited a kingdom that had been running on the momentum of Chikkadevaraja's institutional changes for over half a century. Well structured, well administered, but always chronically underfunded. The army had mutinied only 4 years ago because of unpaid wages. The treasury was empty, and Hyder had stepped up and paid the wages himself from his private resources, and that brought the army's loyalty to him in the process. But Hyder also understood that a state that depended on the ruler's personal finances to meet the payroll was not a state at all. It was no more than a liability. What Hyder Ali had in mind was to bring his own army in line with everything that he saw that the British and the French had built. A salaried standing army trained in European methods. He also figured that he could build a navy capable of challenging British maritime dominance simply because they controlled the coasts, and as long as they did, peace was never at hand. And then Hyder, a great believer in technology, is the person to be credited with developing those iron-cased rockets as well as modern cannon. So Hyder needed money on a scale that land revenues alone could not provide. He needed a windfall. Where was that windfall? He knew exactly where to find one. Bidanur, known by colonial mispronunciation as Bengaluru, and in our own time better known as Nagara, close to Jog Falls in the Malenadu Hill country, was the capital of the Ikkeri Nayakas, or the Nayakas of Keladi, if you like. After the fall of Vijayanagara, the Nayakas had ruled as a sovereign kingdom, issuing their own currency, and accumulated wealth over generations. To call Bidanur wealthy would be an understatement. The Keladi Nayakas had hoarded, not spent, not circulated, but hoarded gold, jewels, and reserves of money called pagodas or parahas or hanas over the course of more than a century of uninterrupted rule. In 1763, Hyder moved on Bidanur. Now, the inset stories of the campaign included stratagems and justifications. The fleeing rulers attempted to scorch the earth and set fire to the palace to deny Hyder the treasury, but Hyder was able to overcome all of these things, able to extinguish the fires and secure the walls before any damage could really affect the outcome. The scale of what Hyder found there entered historical record almost immediately, simply because that was too large a hoard to conceal or trivialize. The historian Mark Wilkes placed the value of the plunder at £12 million sterling, and this in mid-18th century terms. Wilkes was careful to note that this was not merely coined money. The Ikkeri Nayakas had kept wealth outside circulation. Unmanufactured gold, loose jewels, money, hanas, varahas, pagodas that had never entered the trading economy. It was accumulated passive wealth just sitting in vaults, waiting to be mobilized. Hyder's French artillery commander and biographer, Maître de la Tour, described the assessment of the loot in vivid terms. A measuring device normally used for grain was pressed into service to figure out how much gold that they had acquired. Heaps of ingots and jewelry stood higher than a man on horseback. Maître de la Tour recorded that these reserves were so vast that Hyder had to maintain a separate reserve treasury for them, distinct from the Mysore state's working finances. This was more like a sovereign wealth fund, if you like, drawing on it only for specific strategic purposes while keeping the principle intact. The first thing that he did with that principle was to pay his army. Every outstanding military arrear was cleared at once. 20,000 new recruits received substantial advance wages, and the threat of mutiny, which had hung over them, a recurring vulnerability, was removed in a single transaction. And then Hyder used Bidanur to introduce what he had always wanted to do, a salaried standing army, upending centuries of tradition in the Deccan Plateau, where levies or armies were raised only through the personal loyalty of feudal commanders. And now a permanent force trained in European methods was capable of staying in the field for months without disintegrating. Because Hyder was a reliable paymaster, he attracted talent that money could not have bought otherwise. French military advisors came willingly. Displaced soldiers from the Mughal and Maratha empires came. The Mysore Rocket Corps was expanded and funded from Bidanur surpluses. The result, within a few years, was an army unlike any other on the southern plateau. The British took notice. Records from the Madras Presidency, specifically between 1764 and 1766, started to show a growing anxiety about the horse trade, specifically that Hyder was buying up all the available cavalry from Persian and Arab traders at prices that the East India Company could not match. The intelligence reports were being specific. The concern was becoming institutional. A solvent Indian ruler, that itself being a novelty, with a modernized army was, for the British, a genuinely alarming prospect. Hyder did not stop at Bidanur. As we know, he was there to get money for the state. Almost immediately after securing its treasury, he pivoted west. He understood something that many previous Indian rulers had failed to grasp, that in the coming decades, control of the sea would matter as much as control of the land. The British were a maritime power. They could be resupplied, reinforced, and provisioned at sea in ways that no inland army could match. To challenge them meaningfully, Mysore needed a coastline they could control and a navy that had been built. By the mid-1760s, Hyder Ali had secured it. He annexed the vital ports of Bangalore, Honavar, and Basavaraja Durga on the Canara coast, and this gave Mysore uninterrupted access to the Arabian Sea for the very first time. These were not simply commercial acquisitions, they were strategic foundations, in fact. Mysore became a naval arsenal. Honavar gave Mysore that northern anchor, and Basavaraja Durga, which was a fortified island off the Honavar coast, became the sentinel guarding the approach from the north. Now, with the Canara ports, Hyder could export commodities directly to the Persian Gulf and Europe, cutting out the British intermediaries. Importantly, he could import French cannon and muskets without any reference to company controls. Most importantly, he could build a navy, and he did. Arab sailors, Mapila mariners from the Malabar coast, European shipwrights, they were all secured, recruited. Ships were constructed. An entire fleet took shape, hybrid in character, combining European patterned vessels, the tough ones, with the smaller, faster gallivats, suited to the coastal conditions on the west coast. British correspondence for Madras in this period registers that tonal shift, one to nervousness, quite clearly. Reports noted increasing shipbuilding in Bangalore, rising competition in the horse trade, Mysore's growing ability to move goods without using British ports. These were not alarming in isolation by itself, but together they described a state that was methodically reducing its dependence on British-controlled systems, building instead, in parallel, its own military, fiscal, and maritime infrastructure. Mysore was no longer just improvising or riffing. It had become a state capable of absorbing loss, sustaining campaigns, and refusing any kind of accommodation or compromise. And for the British, that was the most dangerous thing an Indian state could be. And now for a quick commercial break. In only 30 seconds, I will be back with the rest of the story right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi, I'm back. While Hyder Ali was building Mysore into a power capable of challenging British dominance, the British were working on a different problem. And this was the gap, physical gap I mean, between its two presidencies. The presidency of Bengal and the presidency of Madras were the company's two principal centers of power in India. Bengal generated most of the revenue. Madras managed the growingly important southern theatre. But there was no secured overland connection between them. The stretch of Andhra coastline between the two presidencies, and that was called the Northern Circars, were formerly under the sovereignty of the Nizam of Hyderabad. It was fertile. It was commercially significant and strategically critical. Without it, the company's two most powerful outposts remained completely isolated from each other, vulnerable of being picked off separately by any sufficiently organized opponent. The northern Circars were 4 principal districts along the Andhra coast: Chikkakole, Rajamandri, Ellur, and Guntur. They controlled the ports of Mosalipatnam or Machilapatnam and Visakhapatnam, and the river systems of the Godavari and Krishna that provided the inland access to the Deccan Plateau. Securing them would give the British an unbroken corridor from Bengal to the Coromandel coast right down the eastern seaboard, converting what had been a fragmented collection of regional enclaves into one unified territorial system capable of mutual support, and it was cohesive. In 1765, remember, flush with the Diwani rights through the Treaty of Allahabad, the company moved to acquire the Circars. They obtained a farman, a royal decree from the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, confirming their right to collect revenues in the northern Circars. From the British perspective in Calcutta, this appeared to be procedurally sound. The emperor had granted it, the matter was settled. The Nizam of Hyderabad, Asaf Jah II, didn't quite share that view. The northern Circars were his territories. He exercised actual authority over them, not some Mughal ruler in Delhi. The British had gone over his head to the Mughal emperor and had emerged with a piece of paper that effectively stripped him of his most strategically valuable coastal districts. So Asaf Jah started to make preparations to recover the northern Circars by force. The British didn't really want this, so they had to move quickly to defuse the crisis. They didn't really withdraw the claim, but they decided that they could get somewhere by negotiating. Diplomacy. So there was a General Caillot, who was deputed from Fort St. George with full powers to make a settlement. The negotiations, though, were conducted against the background of Hyderabad's vulnerabilities, structural ones. The Nizam always faced revenue shortfalls. His treasury was strained. His cavalry, which was the traditional basis of Hyderabad's military strength, was expensive to maintain and getting increasingly difficult to fund. And naturally, rival court factions started to compete for influence. Jar's position was resentful, but not strong enough to sustain outright resistance to the British. And then there was the question of Hyder Ali. The Nizam's expansion had brought him into contested territory along the borders with Mysore. Hyder Ali's growing power was a direct threat to Hyderabad. And here, the British were offering something the Nizam needed: military alliance, guaranteed troops, and artillery support. The Treaty of Hyderabad was signed on the 12th of November 1766. Under its terms, the Nizam ceded the 4 northern Circars to the British, and in return, the British agreed to pay an annual tribute of 9 lakh rupees to him, with the critical provision to supply military assistance to the Nizam whenever he needed it. It was the second provision that transformed the treaty. Now, this was no longer a revenue settlement. This became a military alliance. So, British troops would now have to be stationed in the Deccan under the legal fiction of protecting the Nizam. But their actual function, their command structure, their operational priorities, their chain of command would serve British strategic calculations. Hyderabad had been converted from an independent state now into a client, a vassal. The British now had inserted itself militarily into the heart of the southern Deccan. This was not good news for Mysore. The Treaty of Hyderabad spoke of protecting the Nizam, but never really identified the identity of this enemy. Who the alliance was directed against was never ambiguous, though. A dispatch from the Madras Select Committee, which was dated November 1766, the same month that the Treaty of Hyderabad was signed, referred explicitly to joint operations against the common disturber of Carnatic peace. There was no doubt who that was. It was Hyder Ali. The treaty with the Nizam contained, embedded in its military provisions, a clear and formal agreement to act jointly against Mysore. Under the terms of the treaty, a British force of 2 battalions of infantry and 6 cannon joined the Nizam's army. Their assigned objective, stated plainly in the operational planning of the time, was to reduce the fort of Bangalore. Reduce was just a military term to invade and occupy. Consider what the Treaty of Hyderabad meant from Hyder Ali's perspective. He had watched the British secure Bengal's revenues at Allahabad in 1765. He had watched it link Calcutta to Madras through the northern Circars. He had watched it insert itself militarily into the southern Deccan through Hyderabad, and that was the buffer state that had previously offered some protection to Mysore's northern regions. And now, Hyder Ali was watching a British and Hyderabadi force assemble, with the stated objective being very clear: him. Hyder Ali did not interpret that Treaty of Hyderabad as some sort of a defense arrangement. He read it for what it was: a preparatory one. Every year of delay for him favored the British. Because British finances were growing, British forces were expanding. The sepoy system that had been an experiment in Fort St. George in the 1640s was now a mature institution. Exactly what we've been talking about. Salaried, paid, drilled, contractually loyal employees, which were soldiers, capable of sustaining operations. Every passing year would tighten the cordon around Mysore. Hyder Ali's response to this was not to wait. It was to move first. So he attacked the Carnatic in 1766, coming down from the plateau into the low coastal plains, cutting British supply lines, and forcing a confrontation on terms that he chose rather than the terms that the British imposed. Thus, the First Anglo-Mysore War had begun. It would end 3 years later with one of the most humiliating peace settlements in the company's Indian history. The First Anglo-Mysore War had begun, and in later episodes I will speak in detail about the battles, the 4 Anglo-Mysore Wars. But right now, the die had been cast. From my next episode, we will come to the point that we start the wars themselves. I will talk in detail about the First Anglo-Mysore War and then the rest of the battles to follow. Stay tuned for all that excitement coming up soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.